The room felt colder than I remembered. The mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lights, and the scent of polished wood mixed with something sharper. Anticipation, maybe. Every chair was filled except the one beside mine, the one my father used to sit in during these formal meetings. My stepmother, Irene, sat at the head, chin tilted high, pearls perfectly arranged like a row of tiny white lies. Her sons lounged behind her, arms crossed, smirking like they already knew how this story would end. The lawyer cleared his throat and shuffled a stack of papers. Before he could speak, Irene cut in with that voice she used whenever she wanted to own the room. "Let's not drag this out," she said, folding her manicured hands. "I think it's only fair everyone knows that my late husband decided to leave his estate to those who truly cared for him. My stepdaughter," she glanced at me like she was scanning a stranger, "will not be part of this distribution." For a moment, I just stared at her. I didn't blink, didn't breathe. The words rolled over me, cold and deliberate, like a practiced performance she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. She wanted me small, shocked, silenced, maybe to beg. Instead, I leaned back slightly and twisted the small brass key that hung on a chain around my neck, a habit I'd developed whenever I needed to stay still while others revealed themselves. The lawyer's lips pressed together, and he looked down at the papers again. "Mrs. Crawford," he said carefully, "I think it's best if I read the document as it stands rather than rely on assumptions." Her expression flickered, barely a tremor, but I caught it. For years, she had perfected that social armor, refined manners, sympathetic smiles, a widow's fragility. It fooled everyone except those who had lived close enough to feel the chill underneath. She turned toward him, smile tightening. "Of course," she said sweetly. "By all means." He adjusted his glasses, drew a steady breath, and began reading my father's will. I had already memorized the words long before this day. I knew every clause, every signature, every notarized seal. I knew because I had been there when my father insisted on rewriting it after one of Irene's accidental financial errors. But I kept my expression calm, even as the lawyer's voice filled the room with the truth Irene hadn't anticipated. "Pursuant to the revised will dated April 14th, he said, pausing deliberately, "the estate shall be divided equally between my daughter, Anna, and my wife, Irene Crawford. Furthermore, my daughter shall serve as co-executor, with full access to the family trust and all financial records." The air thickened. Irene blinked once, then twice, before a brittle laugh escaped her throat. "That must be a mistake," she said. "There was no revised will." But there it was, black ink, official seal, notarized and filed. The lawyer slid the paper slightly forward, and the rustle echoed louder than any words. My fingers brushed the key again, its cool metal steadying me as her mask began to crack. Her sons shifted uncomfortably. One of them muttered something about lawyer tricks. The lawyer, unflinching, turned to me and said, "Your father also left you authority to retrieve certain documents from his safety deposit box. He specified you would know which one." I nodded slowly, feeling every eye on me. The tiny brass key caught the light as I turned it in my fingers, and for a fleeting moment, Irene's face drained of color. She recognized it. She had seen my father hand it to me once, years ago, in the quiet of his study. He'd smiled and said, "Keep what's yours safe." That line replayed in my mind like an echo of everything that had led to this moment. The quiet dinners where he and I had talked about legacy, not money. The way he used to test people, not to humiliate, but to see who revealed their greed too soon. Irene had failed that test the day she started asking about his will before his diagnosis was even confirmed. Now, in this silent, charged room, the story was unraveling exactly as he must have foreseen. My stepmother had spent months preparing for her triumph, but all she had really done was build a stage for her own undoing. The lawyer folded his hands. "There's more," he said softly. Irene's jaw clenched. "More?" "Yes," he said. "Your husband included a personal letter to be read at the conclusion of this meeting. It pertains to certain financial transactions conducted during the last year of his life." The silence after that was unbearable. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the tick of a clock somewhere behind me. Irene's composure flickered again, and I realized she wasn't just surprised, she was afraid. I sat there watching her, calm, silent, holding my key, Everything in me wanted to speak, to expose her manipulations, the way she'd cornered my father when he was too weak to argue. But I didn't. I let the lawyer continue, each line of that document cutting through the performance she had built. It struck me, sitting there, how power doesn't always need a raised voice or a slammed door. Sometimes it's as simple as a well-timed silence and a piece of paper that tells the truth. As the lawyer's voice carried on, Irene's confidence drained like water through cracked glass. Her sons shifted again, uneasy, sensing the tide turning but too proud to move. I felt my heartbeat steady, slow, and deliberate. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. When the lawyer paused to turn the page, Irene finally looked at me, eyes burning with disbelief. I met her stare, calm but unyielding, and said quietly, "Dad never liked surprises." The line landed heavier than I expected. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Around us, the silence deepened, and in that stillness, I realized something. The moment of truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet that breaks people open. And as the lawyer prepared to read my father's final letter, I knew this was only the beginning. People always think moments like that are spontaneous, like the shock just happens and everything unfolds naturally. But the truth is, that silence in the lawyer's office had been building for years. It started long before my stepmother announced she was cutting me off. It started with 1,000 little dismissals that slowly rewired the way I learned to move through that house. I remember the first week she moved in. She arrived with boxes labeled fragile, but it wasn't the glassware she was talking about, it was her ego. She had this way of claiming space that looked polite from a distance, shifting my father's photo from the mantel for symmetry, reorganizing his study to help him focus, suggesting I start using the guest room since you're barely home anyway. Every small act was dressed in kindness, but underneath it was a quiet erasure of me. At first, I played along. I smiled when she called me sweetheart, even though it sounded like an apology for something she hadn't done yet. I told myself it wasn't worth the conflict, that my father's happiness mattered more than my pride. But there was this one evening. He'd fallen asleep on the couch, his favorite old Western humming on the TV, and she whispered something I'll never forget. She said, "You should be grateful, Anna. Your father's made sure you'll be taken care of, but only if you behave." That word behave stuck to me like a stain. I didn't argue. I just nodded, got up quietly, and went to my room. That night, I started a folder on my laptop. A simple one just titled Notes. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but I started keeping track. Things she moved, things she said, things she signed. It wasn't revenge. It was insurance. The first real entry came a week later, when she convinced my dad to close his joint account with me to simplify bills. She said it in front of him, smiling like it was the most logical idea in the world. I watched him hesitate, then nod, too tired to argue. I noted the date, the bank name, and her phrasing word for word. It didn't feel like much at the time, just quiet observation. But looking back, that was the first brick in the wall of proof I'd eventually build. She was good at painting stories. To neighbors, she was the picture of patience, caring for an aging husband and a difficult stepdaughter who couldn't move on. She'd host small dinners, where she'd pour wine and sprinkle subtle comments like, "It's hard when a child can't accept new love," or, "I know she misses her mother, but we've all got to grow." Every phrase had just enough sympathy to make her sound like the saint of blended families. I learned to stop defending myself. Every time I tried, it just made me look defensive, which was exactly what she wanted. So I went quiet, and in that quiet, I noticed more than she ever realized. The way she handled the mail first every morning. The phone calls she took in the garden, whispering about moving things around before it's too late. The quick flicker of guilt when she saw me standing in the doorway. Silence became my strategy. The kind that makes people underestimate you. And if I'm being honest, there's a strange power in being underestimated. It buys you time, patience, and a front row seat to your opponent's mistakes. I'd visit Dad at the care facility and bring him the crossword puzzles he loved. Sometimes when she wasn't around, he'd squeeze my hand and say, "You're my anchor, kiddo. Promise me you'll hold steady." I didn't understand what he meant at first, but as she started talking more about estate planning and less about his recovery, it clicked. He knew something I didn't. And that's when the key appeared. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. She was hosting another support brunch for her friends, and I escaped upstairs to breathe. On Dad's dresser sat a small envelope with my name written in his shaky handwriting. Inside was a brass key, the same one I later wore to the will reading, and a note that said only, "Keep what's yours safe. Love, Dad." No explanations, no details, just that line. I remember sitting there for a long time, the sound of laughter drifting up from the living room below. They were all down there talking about how fragile life is, sipping mimosas off crystal glassware that didn't even belong to her. And I was upstairs, holding a secret that felt heavier than it looked. That key became my anchor, my proof that Dad saw me even when the world around us didn't. I didn't know what it opened yet, but I knew it was a promise, something she couldn't touch no matter how many papers she filed or stories she spun. Looking back now, I realize that was the turning point. Not the moment I fought back, but the moment I decided I wouldn't play her game anymore. Instead of reacting, I'd document. Instead of shouting, I'd observe. Because the truth has its own rhythm. It doesn't need volume, just patience. If you've ever been in that kind of position, where someone paints you as the problem while they quietly rewrite the rules, you'll understand what I mean. You start to doubt your own memory until one day, you decide to write it all down. You stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You stop chasing fairness and start collecting facts. That's what I did, and it's what made all the difference later. So before I take you back into that lawyer's office, let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed silent long enough for the truth to build its own voice? If you have, you already know it's not weakness. It's the most powerful kind of preparation there is. When my father started getting sick, the whole rhythm of our house changed. It was like the walls learned to whisper, carrying bits of conversations I was never supposed to hear. Doctors, insurance calls, whispered words like treatment and expenses. My stepmother handled most of it. She made sure everyone knew she was the capable one. She'd stand by the kitchen counter with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in that calm, professional tone she used when she wanted to sound in control. And for a while, I let her have that. It was easier to focus on Dad, on trying to make him laugh, on pretending everything was normal. But normal disappeared quickly. One afternoon, I found him sitting in his study, his sanctuary, lined with books, old photographs, and the smell of cedar polish. He was staring at a folder on his desk, his hands trembling slightly. When I asked if he was okay, he smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hides worry. "She's been helping with the bills," he said softly, "just moving things around to keep it simple." The word stuck with me, moving things around. I asked to see what he meant, but he brushed it off, said not to worry. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened my laptop and logged into my father's old email. He'd given me the password years ago when he wanted help setting up automatic payments. What I found wasn't shocking, not yet, but it was unsettling. Notifications of closed accounts. Transfer receipts I didn't recognize. Bank alerts labeled approved transaction. Each one small enough to seem innocent, but together they formed a pattern. The next morning, I watched her pour his medication and stir his tea like everything was fine. The contrast was surreal, her soft voice and gentle hands set against the quiet theft happening beneath it all. I realized then that her control wasn't built on power, but on access. Access to passwords, to papers, to trust. She made herself indispensable by managing everything he was too tired to manage himself. I wanted to confront her. I really did. But then I remembered how she thrived on chaos, how she used emotion as evidence. If I shouted, I'd look ungrateful. If I accused, I'd look paranoid. So instead, I learned patience. I copied what I could, saved what I found, and started learning what joint executor really meant. Weeks passed. Dad's health dipped and climbed, like the tide pulling back before a storm. She hovered constantly, rearranging schedules, signing forms for convenience. I started noticing little changes in the house too, his watch missing from the dresser, his signature disappearing from framed photos replaced with ones she'd edited or reframed. She was rewriting not just his finances, but his history. Then came the day he handed me the lockbox. It was early evening, the golden hour light pooling through the study window. He'd called me in quietly while she was on the phone in another room. The box was small, dark metal with a faint dent on one corner. "This belonged to your grandfather," he said, sliding it across the desk. "And now it's yours." I frowned. "Dad, what is this for?" He looked at me the way he used to when I was little, like he was choosing his words carefully. "Because I trust you to protect what matters more than appearances," he said. "Inside, there's only what needs to be found when the time is right." I wanted to ask more, but before I could, I heard her heels click down the hallway. He just nodded once, and that was enough. I kept the box hidden in my old closet, behind a stack of dusty books. It wasn't until months later, after the funeral, after the will reading, that I realized how much weight those words carried. Back then, though, it just felt like another secret between us. A small rebellion in a house where everything was being taken apart and reassembled to suit her version of order. I remember one night, sitting at the dining table after they'd both gone to bed, flipping the brass key in my hand under the lamplight. The metal was worn smooth from years of use, but when I looked closer, I noticed tiny scratches near the teeth, numbers, faint but visible, 1804. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, maybe a date. Then I remembered my father's habit of marking things by significance. April 18th, his wedding anniversary with my mother. It hit me that the lockbox wasn't about documents alone. It was about legacy, about remembering what she wanted to erase. That night, I wrote everything down in my folder. The accounts, the patterns, the lockbox, the date. It wasn't evidence yet, just fragments of a truth waiting for context. But something inside me shifted. I stopped feeling like the powerless daughter and started thinking like someone preparing for trial. Over the next few months, her confidence grew in equal measure to his decline. She began speaking for him in front of doctors, answering before he could. She'd intercept my calls, saying he was resting, and then brag later to friends about how tiring caregiving can be when you're the only reliable one. But Dad still found quiet ways to remind me he was aware. Once, he slipped me a note tucked inside a crossword book. It said, "If she locks doors, it means you have the key." That was all. And I swear it felt like he was giving me permission, not to fight her outright, but to wait until truth could speak on its own. I kept the box untouched. I didn't open it, didn't even try. Some part of me knew that breaking that trust too early would ruin what he'd set in motion. Instead, I focused on keeping my composure. I smiled when she bragged about her efficiency. I thanked her when she said I should let the grown-ups handle the estate. And all the while, I kept building my quiet record. Years later, standing in that lawyer's office, when I turned the brass key in my fingers, I realized that patience had been my sharpest weapon. Because control built on deceit is always temporary. It just takes time for the truth to find its opening. And my father, even in death, had left me exactly what I needed to unlock it. After Dad passed, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a stage that someone else had taken over. Every photo that once told our family's story was replaced overnight with new frames, new smiles that didn't include me. His reading glasses disappeared from the coffee table, his favorite chair was draped with one of her cream-colored throws, and she began referring to the house as hers. The shift wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, quiet, and final. I stayed for a few weeks after the funeral, mostly to make sure the logistics were handled, papers signed, accounts closed, all the practical things grief demands before it lets you feel. She encouraged me to take my time, but the way she hovered when I walked into certain rooms told a different story. I'd catch her watching me from doorways, eyes sharp but mouth smiling. "You must be exhausted," she'd say. "Grief can cloud judgment." It was always phrased like concern, but it felt like a warning. Her family began showing up more often, too. Cousins I barely knew came over to help, rearranging furniture and packing boxes labeled estate items. They laughed loudly, opened my father's liquor cabinet, toasted to his generosity. I started to feel like a ghost wandering through my own memories. They'd look right past me, stepping over the emotional wreckage of my father's life as if I weren't there. One afternoon, I came downstairs to find them in his study, sorting through his personal files. My stepmother stood behind the desk, directing them like a general. "We'll need all the financials together before the will reading," she said. "I'll take charge of these." I froze in the doorway. That desk had been sacred. It was where Dad wrote letters, paid bills, did his crossword puzzles every morning. Seeing strangers paw through his things felt like an invasion, not of property, but of memory. "I don't think Dad would have wanted anyone else touching his papers," I said quietly. She turned to me with that practiced pity smile. "Oh, sweetheart, don't make this harder than it already is. You're grieving. We're all trying to help." Help. The word sounded like manipulation disguised as mercy. Her relatives nodded, murmuring agreement, as though compassion came with an audience. That night I packed a small suitcase, not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed to prove to myself I could. I couldn't breathe in that house anymore, surrounded by her curated version of mourning. Everywhere I looked, something of my father's was gone or replaced for tidiness. The framed picture of us fishing, the old clock he'd repaired himself, even the plant he'd nursed back from a single stem, all vanished. When I finally walked out to my car, she followed me to the driveway. "Don't worry about the will reading," she said, touching my arm. "Everything's already handled. You can just show up to sign whatever's necessary. It's what your father would have wanted." Her tone was sugar, but her eyes were steel. That was the first time I felt true anger rise, not the kind that screams, but the kind that burns slow and steady. I didn't argue. I just nodded, got in my car, and drove away. For the next few weeks, I lived out of a small apartment near the edge of town. It was quiet, unremarkable, and exactly what I needed. I went to work, came home, and tried not to think about how the world had kept moving while mine had stopped. Grief has a strange way of rearranging priorities. It makes you notice what still feels solid when everything else collapses. One of those solid things came from an unexpected place. The family accountant, Mr. Reeves, called me one afternoon. He'd been with my father for nearly 20 years, a quiet man with a voice that always sounded like he was confiding something important. "Anna," he said carefully, "I'm not supposed to interfere, but there's something you should probably see before the will reading." I felt my chest tighten. "What kind of something?" He hesitated. "Your stepmother been making changes. Transfers, asset movements, all legal on the surface, but the timing is interesting. If your father hadn't updated certain documents before he passed, her actions might complicate things." The word complicate carried the weight of everything I feared. "What do you mean, if he hadn't updated them?" He cleared his throat. "Just check the trust registry. You'll find what I can't say outright." That was all he offered before politely ending the call, as though we'd just discussed the weather. But his tone, firm, careful, told me it was more than a courtesy. It was a warning disguised as professionalism. That night I pulled out my laptop, heart pounding. I opened the state's trust registry, entered my father's full name, and waited. The page loaded slowly, as if even the system was reluctant to reveal what it knew. And then it appeared. A notation, small but significant, an update filed just months before his death. The date matched the timeline of his decline, but what mattered more was the signature beside it. His, witnessed and notarized. I printed the document, staring at the legal stamp at the bottom like it was a lifeline. That's when it hit me. She didn't know about this. She couldn't have. Because if she had, she would have destroyed it by now, just like everything else that tied him to me. For the first time in months, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, just steadiness. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the manipulation or the quiet theft. I had proof, small but powerful, and that meant I wasn't powerless anymore. When I closed my laptop that night, I looked at the brass key resting on the bedside table. It caught the faint light from the window, glinting like an answer I hadn't yet unlocked. I picked it up, turned it in my fingers, and whispered into the stillness, "I'm still here, Dad." Because even though she'd filled the house with her voice, her family, and her false version of love, there were still things she couldn't touch. The truth. And me, it's strange how help sometimes arrives from the quiet corners of your past, the people you almost forgot you had in your corner until they suddenly reappear, steady and unshaken. That's how it was with Judge Whitman. He'd been my father's closest friend since before I was born. I still remember him from my childhood birthdays. Tall, slow-speaking, always carrying a small notebook that he'd jot things into, even during conversations. My father used to call him the compass. The man who never lost his bearings, no matter how messy life got. A week after I found the updated trust registry, I received a letter in the mail, typed on crisp stationery. It was short, just a few sentences. Anna, your father asked me to look after his affairs if things became complicated. Please call me when you're ready. H. Whitman. The timing felt almost impossible, as if my father had orchestrated the moment from somewhere beyond. I called that same evening, half expecting to get a secretary, but he answered himself, his voice deep and measured, just as I remembered. Anna, he said softly, I was wondering when you'd reach out. Your father trusted your judgment. I'm glad you've been patient. That word, patient, caught me off guard. I hadn't told him anything yet, but somehow he already knew what kind of patience it took to survive in silence. We met the next morning at a small cafe near the courthouse, the kind of place where conversations disappear under the hum of espresso machines. He was older now, hair silver instead of gray, but his eyes were the same calm blue. When I sat down, he reached into his briefcase and set a folder between us. I can't get involved directly, he said, but I can remind you what the law allows you to know. Inside the folder were copies of documents, things I hadn't seen before, property records, transfer requests, a bank statement listing withdrawals labeled as medical expenses, except the dates didn't line up with any hospital visits I knew of. She moved money, I said quietly. He nodded. Yes, but not cleanly. Your father updated his trust in time to protect what mattered most. The challenge will be proving intent without escalating conflict. I must have looked uncertain because he leaned forward slightly and said, You're not here to fight her, Anna. You're here to finish what your father started, gracefully, legally, and with documentation. It wasn't the vengeance speech I'd been secretly craving, but it was the truth I needed to hear. We talked for over an hour. He explained how estate law worked, how verbal promises meant nothing once the paperwork was signed, how evidence always spoke louder than outrage. Your stepmother thrives on reaction, he said. She wins when you appear emotional, so don't. Gather facts, not arguments. When I left the cafe, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. I held that folder tight, not because it held victory, but because it gave shape to something I'd been missing, validation. Until then, every instinct I followed felt like guesswork, a daughter's paranoia clashing with grief. But now I had a mentor, someone who not only believed me but guided me with calm precision. The feeling was almost disorienting. I didn't have to shout anymore. I didn't even have to prove my pain. All I had to do was follow the trail of her arrogance and let the law do the rest. That night, I sat by my small apartment window, spreading out the papers across the table. The brass key lay beside them, catching the reflection of the streetlight outside. It felt like the two belonged together, the tangible proof of my father's foresight and the quiet alliance of the man he trusted most. The next few days blurred into preparation. I visited the county records office again, making sure every document Judge Whitman had referenced was properly filed. I learned how to request certified copies, how to log timestamps, how to trace signatures through public registries. It was tedious, but in that monotony, I found strength. Every line of ink was a piece of armor. Meanwhile, Irene continued her performance. She called me occasionally, her tone sugary and distant, updating me on arrangements I'd never agreed to. The lawyer will handle everything, she'd say, as if she was being generous. You don't need to worry about details. But details were exactly what I lived for now. Once, during one of those calls, she mentioned, almost casually, You'll be relieved to know I've already settled the estate's small debts. There wasn't much left after the hospital bills anyway. Her voice held that same confidence she wore like perfume, strong enough to fill every room. But underneath it, I heard something new, a crack, faint but present. She was too comfortable, too certain I was out of the loop. After the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long moment and whispered, You have no idea what's coming, do you? Not as a threat, but as a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. A few days later, I met with Whitman again. This time in his office, a small room lined with books and court records, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. He had that same notebook open, pen poised as I explained everything I'd found. When I finished, he smiled faintly. "You've done your homework," he said. "Good, you're ready for the next part." He handed me a new document, a formal letter authorizing me, as co-executor of the estate, to access certain sealed materials, my father's lockbox included. I traced my thumb over the embossed seal. "So this means she can't block me anymore." "She can try," he said, "but she'll lose. The law favors transparency when one party has something to hide." For the first time in months, I felt a quiet kind of confidence settle in my chest. It wasn't joy or vindication, just balance. The scales were finally beginning to tip back to where they belonged. As I left his office, he stopped me at the door and said, "Anna, remember, your father's legacy isn't just what he left behind. It's how you protect it." That night, I placed the letter inside the lockbox key envelope. The brass glinted under the lamp, a small, silent witness to the storm that was about to turn. I didn't need to confront her yet. I just needed to keep my records straight, my voice steady, and my allies close. Because the truth was already moving in my direction, slowly, methodically, the way justice always does when you've given it time to find its proof. The lockbox was heavier than I remembered, not in weight, but in meaning. It sat on my kitchen table like a question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The bank clerk had handed it over with a neutral smile, unaware that inside that small metal container lay the turning point of everything my stepmother thought she'd buried. I turned the brass key in my fingers a few times before sliding it into the slot. The click it made echoed through the quiet of my apartment, sharp and final, like a door opening into the truth. Inside were neatly arranged folders, a few envelopes with my father's handwriting, and one small USB drive. My pulse thudded as I lifted the papers out one by one. There were copies of his medical invoices, meticulous records that contradicted Irene's claims about the overwhelming hospital debts. The totals didn't even come close to the figures she'd mentioned on the phone. The more I looked, the clearer it became. She'd been siphoning money under the guise of care. And then I saw it, the letter. It was sealed with wax, my name written across the front in my father's familiar hand. I hesitated, not because I feared what it might say, but because I already missed the voice that came with it. When I finally opened it, his words were as measured and deliberate as he'd always been. "Anna, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the chance to explain everything face to face. I trusted Irene to manage certain things, but not everything. Keep this letter safe and take it to Judge Whitman when the time comes. There's more in the safe deposit record than just numbers. You'll understand soon." There was no anger in his tone, no bitterness, just quiet foresight. It was the kind of message that came from someone who knew exactly how people would behave once he was gone. I wiped my eyes and steadied myself. The grief was still there, raw and tender, but for the first time it was anchored by purpose. The next morning I met with Whitman again, the folder tucked under my arm. His secretary ushered me in and he stood when I entered. I laid everything out on his desk, the invoices, the letter, the USB. He read the first few pages in silence, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "She moved funds under false pretenses," he said, "but we'll need an official record to make it irrefutable." "What kind of record?" I asked. He tapped the USB drive. "Whatever on that might help, but first we'll get a statement from the bank. A withdrawal that large always leaves a footprint." That afternoon, we walked together into the bank where my father had held his accounts. The air was cold and sterile, every sound muffled by the thick carpet and glass partitions. When I gave the teller my authorization letter, her polite expression shifted slightly, just a flicker of discomfort, the kind that happens when someone realizes the story they've been told isn't matching the documents in front of them. Within minutes, she retrieved a log from the archives and printed out a list of transactions spanning the last year of my father's life. I recognized Irene's signature on several withdrawals labeled as authorized caretaker expenses. One of them was dated 3 weeks after my father's final hospitalization, days when he was no longer able to speak. Whitman watched quietly as I scanned the papers, his hands clasped behind his back. "Keep those copies," he said. "They'll serve as your first receipt." The phrase lingered in my mind. First receipt. It wasn't just proof of fraud, it was the beginning of accountability. When I got home, I plugged in the USB drive, half afraid of what I'd find. It contained a single video file, time-stamped 6 months before his passing. My father sat at his desk, thinner than I remembered, but alert. "If anything happens to me," he said into the camera, "Anna, I want you to know I've arranged things so the truth can be found easily. Don't let anyone rush you. Patience will protect you." He paused, then added, almost tenderly, "I trust you more than anyone else in this world." The video ended abruptly, leaving me in silence. For a long time, I just sat there, the glow of the screen lighting the papers around me. The brass key lay beside the keyboard again, its reflection flickering in the light. It had become more than just a key. It was a reminder that my father had trusted me with both access and restraint. Later that evening, I printed multiple copies of the bank logs and labeled each folder meticulously. I even placed one set in a sealed envelope marked for attorney use only. My father's voice still echoed in my head. "Patience will protect you." And so I waited, not idly but deliberately. Every call from Irene now felt like a test. She continued her charade, sending me brief updates, pretending everything was under control. But I no longer needed to argue. Each lie she told only sharpened the edge of the truth I held. One afternoon, she called again, her tone clipped. "I've scheduled the next estate meeting," she said. "It's mostly a formality, but the lawyer will finalize the distribution. You don't need to attend if you'd rather avoid the stress." I almost laughed. "Oh, I'll be there," I replied evenly. "In fact, I'll bring a few things that might make the conversation clearer." She hesitated, then forced a laugh of her own. "Always so dramatic, Anna. Your father wouldn't want this kind of tension." I smiled into the silence before hanging up. "He want the truth," I whispered. That night, I gathered all the documents, the receipts, the letter, the USB, and placed them neatly in my briefcase. The brass key rested on top, gleaming softly under the lamp. The pieces were finally aligning, and I could feel the weight of what was coming. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about respect, about restoring the dignity my father had earned and ensuring the woman who had treated his death like a transaction would have to face the quiet power of evidence. The first receipt was secured. The next step would take everything I'd learned about silence, timing, and composure. Because soon, it wouldn't be about what she said. It would be about what she could no longer deny. The days leading up to the estate meeting felt like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Everything looked calm on the surface. Emails went unanswered. Calls grew shorter. Even Irene's performative cheer faded into polite indifference. But underneath it, I could feel something brewing. Every instinct in me whispered that she was preparing for a spectacle, the kind of dramatic performance she'd perfected over the years. I spent those days preparing too, though not with theatrics. I went over every piece of paper again, highlighting discrepancies, aligning dates, making sure every copy was notarized and time-stamped. The receipts, the video, the letter from my father, each one told a story. I wasn't just collecting documents anymore. I was constructing a quiet, unshakable truth. The morning of the meeting, I woke before sunrise. The city was still half asleep, the air cool and colorless. I made tea instead of coffee, wanting something steady, grounding. The brass key lay on the counter exactly where I'd left it. I picked it up and slipped it into my coat pocket, feeling its weight against my hand. My father used to say, "A key's only as powerful as what it protects." At the lawyer's office, the conference room was staged to look neutral. Mahogany table, cream walls, water glasses lined up like soldiers. But I could feel the tension hiding in every polished surface. Irene was already there, draped in black silk, her pearl earrings catching the light. She looked like grief personified, though the smirk tugging at her mouth betrayed something else entirely. "Anna," she said, standing just long enough to make it look cordial. "You look tired, dear. These things can take such a toll." "I'm fine," I said softly, setting my briefcase on the table. "Thanks for your concern." The lawyer, Mr. Harlan, entered a moment later, his tone brisk but courteous. "Let's begin. We'll review the final distribution as outlined in Mr. Taylor's updated will." Updated? The word carried an edge now. I watched Irene's posture shift ever so slightly when he said it, her fingers tightening around her pen. Harlan started reading through the formalities, listing assets, beneficiaries, clauses. For the first few minutes, Irene's confidence filled the room like perfume, sickly sweet, impossible to ignore. She nodded at the right moments, sighed delicately when my father's generosity toward her was mentioned. But then came the clause she didn't expect. "And as per the amendment signed 6 months prior," Harlan continued, adjusting his glasses, "a portion of the estate is placed in a protective trust, co-managed by Anna Taylor and an appointed trustee. The assets listed under that clause include," he paused, "properties and accounts totaling approximately half of the estate's liquid value." Irene blinked, once, twice. Her smile faltered, and the silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. "There must be a mistake," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "That's not what—" Harlan raised a hand gently. "All documents have been verified. Your husband's signature is authenticated. Any changes would require both witnesses and a notary, which, as you can see," he tapped the file, "are fully in order." I didn't gloat. I just sat there, quiet, steady, letting the truth settle. Her performance cracked further, panic slipping through the cracks in her composure. "This is absurd," she said. "He was ill. He didn't even know what he was signing." That was my cue. I opened my briefcase and slid a small folder across the table. "Actually," I said calmly, "he knew exactly what he was doing, and he left proof." Inside were the printed bank records and a copy of my father's handwritten letter. Harlan took one look, eyebrows lifting. Irene leaned forward, eyes darting over the documents. "Where did you get these?" she hissed. "From the safe deposit box he authorized me to access," I replied. "And before you accuse me of tampering, here's the verification letter from Judge Whitman." Harlan nodded slowly, reading through the notarized page. "That's legitimate," he confirmed. The room went quiet. For a moment, even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Irene sat back in her chair, her face pale, the corners of her mouth twitching as if she couldn't decide whether to deny or demand. "You think this proves anything?" she snapped finally. "So he kept a few records. It doesn't change the fact that I took care of him when no one else did." Her words were meant to sting, but I didn't flinch. "You did take care of him," I said softly, "and he made sure you were compensated for that, but you also took what wasn't yours. You called it medical expenses. The problem is, the bank calls it embezzlement." Whitman's voice echoed in my memory. "Gather facts, not arguments." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Taylor," he said carefully, "these documents will need to be reviewed. If they're accurate, there may be grounds for an inquiry. I suggest we pause proceedings until that's resolved." Irene's eyes darted toward me, fury barely contained. "You've been planning this, haven't you?" she whispered. "No," I said quietly, standing. "He did." I gathered my papers and walked toward the door. Behind me, I could hear her muttering, disbelief laced with outrage. The brass key pressed against my palm as I gripped it inside my pocket, a reminder of the patience it took to reach this moment. Outside, the air was crisp, the sunlight pale but steady. For the first time, I felt something loosen in my chest. This wasn't the end yet. There was still more to uncover, more to clarify, but I had shifted the balance. That night, I sat by the window again, the city lights flickering below. I replayed the moment in my mind, not with triumph, but with quiet relief. Irene's mask had slipped in front of witnesses. The truth was out of the shadows now, documented and undeniable. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line, first receipt delivered, second in motion. I didn't know yet what form the next proof would take, but I could feel it. Another piece of evidence waiting to surface, something that would turn exposure into accountability. For now, I let myself rest, not because the war was over, but because I'd learned how to win quietly, one piece of paper at a time. The morning after the estate meeting, I woke to a silence that felt heavier than usual. It wasn't peace. It was the pause between waves. I knew Irene wouldn't let things sit quietly. She never did. She'd always believed that if she spoke louder, people would take her side. But this time, the narrative wasn't hers to control anymore. The lawyer had copies of the documents, Whitman was watching closely, and the bank logs had already raised questions. The proof had started moving through the channels where truth travels slowly but surely, officially, verifiably. I spent that morning organizing everything again. Every receipt, every page was now in triplicate, one set for the attorney, one for the court if it came to that, and one I kept at home in a small lockbox that wasn't just symbolic anymore, it was strategy. I'd labeled each envelope with care. Medical discrepancies, bank withdrawals, estate amendments, video testament. Every category told a part of the same story. By midday, my phone buzzed with a call from the bank's fraud department. The woman's voice was calm, professional. "Ms. Taylor, we've reviewed the documents your representative submitted. There appear to be inconsistencies in the withdrawals listed under caretaker authorization. We'll need to verify a few signatures. Could you come in this afternoon?" I agreed, my heart steady but alert. The bank was the next battlefield, though it wasn't one fought with raised voices. It was fought with timestamps, signatures, and the quiet language of records. When I arrived, the branch manager, a middle-aged man named Dawson, greeted me in his office. His tone was careful, but his eyes told me he already knew something was wrong. "We're required to follow up on any potential misuse of fiduciary accounts," he explained. "Given your documentation and your father's trust terms, it's appropriate that you're here." He pulled up a screen on his computer and showed me a digital signature record. "This is Mrs. Taylor's signature on a withdrawal from March 11th, he said, zooming in. Then he opened another from 2 weeks later, same name, same looping flourish, but the tail of the signature looked off. Our internal system flagged this as inconsistent. He printed both and placed them in front of me. "We'll send these for forensic verification," he continued. "In the meantime, the account in question will be temporarily restricted from further transactions until the estate's rightful management is confirmed." That was it. That was the second receipt. The bank had officially frozen the money, quietly, lawfully, and entirely within the rules. Irene could spin whatever stories she wanted to, but the numbers were no longer hers to touch. When I left the bank, I sat in my car for a long while, just breathing. The autumn air had turned sharp, the kind that carried both chill and clarity. I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. Like the truth was finally taking form in places beyond my reach, reinforced by people whose only loyalty was to procedure. Later that afternoon, I stopped by Whitman's office to update him. He listened carefully, hands steepled, nodding slowly as I explained what had happened. When I finished, he smiled faintly, that same small, knowing expression he always wore when things were moving exactly as they should. "Good," he said. "You didn't rush. You gave her enough space to act out her arrogance. That's what traps people like her, the belief that they can rewrite reality without consequence." He opened a drawer and handed me a document stamped with an official seal. "This is a request for an audit. It'll ensure every financial record tied to your father's estate is reviewed. It's not an accusation, it's a request for clarity, which in law is a much more powerful thing." I took it in both hands, feeling the embossed edge of the paper. It wasn't vengeance, it was validation, dressed in legal formality. When I got home, I sent a copy of the audit request to Harlan, the estate lawyer, and filed another in my records. I didn't message Irene. I didn't need to. The silence between us had already become its own kind of message, a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply sits still while the other person unravels. 2 days passed before she broke that silence. Her number flashed on my screen late in the evening. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Are you proud of yourself?" she hissed. "You've embarrassed me in front of everyone. The bank froze the account because of your lies." I kept my tone even. "The bank acted on its own review. I didn't accuse you of anything, Irene." "You've always been ungrateful," she said, voice trembling with fury. Your father wanted me to have peace after he passed, and you can't stand that, can you? Peace isn't built on stolen ground, I said quietly. There was a pause, long, cold, brittle. Then she hung up. I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone, then turned it face down. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was a strange kind of sorrow, mixed with relief. I'd spent years letting her words bruise me, her manipulations shape the story of who I was. But now, every insult fell flat. Every lie met a wall of evidence she couldn't push through. That night, I wrote a single note in my journal. Second receipt confirmed. System in motion. I underlined it twice. Then, almost without thinking, I picked up the brass key from the desk and placed it back into its envelope. The key had done its job. It had opened the door to truth. Now, it was no longer about unlocking things. It was about letting light into the rooms that had been dark for too long. I didn't know yet how Irene would react when the audit results came back, but I suspected she'd try to twist the narrative again, maybe even stage some kind of public scene. That was fine. I was ready for that too. Because every storm eventually clears, and when it does, people remember who stood calm through it, not the ones who screamed the loudest, but the ones who kept their receipts. The estate's follow-up meeting was set for the following week, but by then, the silence surrounding Irene had started to feel theatrical. She hadn't called, hadn't emailed, hadn't even sent one of her veiled messages through mutual acquaintances. That kind of quiet from her didn't mean surrender, it meant calculation. I knew her rhythm too well. When Irene disappeared, she was preparing a show. The morning of the meeting, I dressed simply, a navy dress, my hair tied back, minimal jewelry. I wanted to look composed, not combative. The brass key slipped into my pocket automatically, almost out of habit now, like a talisman for courage. I wasn't sure whether I'd need it, but somehow it felt right to carry it. When I arrived, the conference room was fuller than before. The lawyer, of course, was there, but so was a representative from the bank and, to my surprise, a notary and an auditor, apparently summoned by the audit request Whitman had filed. Irene sat at the far end of the table, her posture rigid, her lipstick too bright, her grief too rehearsed. The air buzzed with polite tension. She didn't look at me as I entered, but her hand tapped an impatient rhythm against her chair. Harlan began with his usual calm professionalism. Today's purpose is to review the estate accounts and address any discrepancies raised during the audit process. This isn't a hearing, it's a clarification. He might as well have said this is where we start unmasking things, because that's exactly what it felt like. The bank representative opened a file, flipping through printed pages. We've confirmed irregular withdrawals from the trust's medical account, she said. Some authorizations appear forged. The handwriting and digital signature inconsistencies have been verified by our internal examiner. Irene's face flushed. That's ridiculous, she said, her voice trembling between outrage and fear. He told me to take what I needed. He trusted me. Harlan remained measured. Mrs. Taylor, do you have any written documentation to support that claim? She hesitated. He was well. He couldn't sign things himself anymore. The auditor's gaze sharpened. So you're confirming that you managed funds without formal consent? She blinked rapidly. That's not what I said. It was like watching a dam crack, one sentence at a time. I stayed quiet, my folder open but untouched. Every instinct screamed to speak, to remind her how she'd paraded herself at the hospital, how she'd insisted I was too emotional to handle Dad's affairs. But this moment wasn't about vengeance. It was about patience finally being seen. Then the auditor turned toward me. Ms. Taylor, do you have any additional records to contribute? I reached into my folder and pulled out 2 items. The first was the printed transcript of the video from my father's USB. The second was a copy of his handwritten note, the one that ended with, "You'll understand soon." This was found in his lockbox, I said quietly. It verifies he was aware of the transfers and that he placed safeguards for transparency. He also confirmed in video that any instructions not documented in writing were invalid. Harlan nodded and handed the documents to the auditor, who examined them carefully. The room was silent except for the faint clicking of her pen as she read. Finally, she looked up. "This establishes intent," she said. "The deceased clearly differentiated between authorized and unauthorized actions." That single word, unauthorized, seemed to deflate Irene. She sat back in her chair, eyes darting toward the door as though she wanted to leave but couldn't. "I've given my life to that man," she muttered, her voice breaking. "You think this is what he wanted, to humiliate me like this?" I didn't answer. For years, she'd made every moment about her. Her sorrow had always been louder than anyone else's, her needs always more urgent. But now, the truth stood on paper between us, steady and unflinching. Harlan cleared his throat. "The audit findings will be filed with the probate court. The next steps are procedural, but the record will reflect verified misuse of estate funds. Depending on Mrs. Taylor's cooperation, the consequences could range from restitution to formal charges." That word, charges, hung in the air like thunder waiting to roll. Irene's hands trembled. "You can't do this to me," she whispered, almost pleading now. "I took care of him. I was there when you were." Finally, I met her gaze. "You were there, yes," I said softly. "But so was I, Irene. Every day you think I wasn't watching, I was taking notes. I just didn't shout about it." A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, followed by something that looked almost like regret, but only for herself. The lawyer adjourned the meeting soon after, promising follow-up filings. Everyone began to gather their papers, and as the noise of shuffling documents filled the room, I felt an odd calm settle over me. Not triumph, just the end of the storm's first wave. As we left the room, Irene brushed past me, her perfume sharp and cold. "You think this makes you righteous," she whispered. "You're as ruthless as your father was." I looked at her not unkindly. "No," I said, "just thorough." Outside, the sky was gray, the kind of overcast that made the world look washed clean. I stopped at the courthouse steps, the brass key still warm in my pocket. It had opened the door to the truth, but now I realized it also symbolized something else, a kind of passing of stewardship. My father hadn't chosen me to win. He'd chosen me to guard what was rightfully his legacy and mine. Whitman called later that evening. "I heard about the meeting," he said. "You handled it well." "Does it ever feel good?" I asked. "Doing the right thing when it hurts someone else?" There was a long pause before he answered. "No, but it feels necessary, and necessary is better than good." After the call, I sat alone by the window again. The city lights flickered faintly against the glass, and in their reflection, I saw my father's watch sitting on the table, a quiet reminder of time, patience, and all the invisible ways people keep promises. The public confrontation had passed. The documents were filed. The evidence was now in the hands of systems bigger than me. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel small inside those systems. I felt seen. There was still fallout ahead. I knew that. But as I turned the brass key over in my hand, I realized something had shifted. The key no longer represented access. It represented closure. The truth was no longer locked away. It was out there, in the open, waiting for the world to see it for what it was. The next morning, the story had already begun to ripple. Not in headlines or public scandals. No, Irene wasn't important enough for that. But through the quiet corridors of the community my father had spent his life building. His business partners, the board members from the charity he chaired, even a few of his old colleagues had caught whispers of what had happened at the estate review. It's strange how the truth doesn't always need an audience. It just needs a few ears that care enough to pass it on. By the time I arrived at Whitman's office for our follow-up meeting, he already knew. "The town talks faster than the internet," he said dryly as I sat down. "Half the Rotary Club called me this morning asking if it was true." "Let them talk," I said. "She's been telling her version of events for months. It's about time reality caught up." He smiled faintly. "You sound like your father." I wasn't sure if that was comfort or warning, but I took it as both. Whitman reviewed the audit summary and confirmed what I already suspected. The misuse of funds was undeniable. There was talk of a formal restitution order. Irene would likely avoid criminal charges if she cooperated, but her access to the estate was permanently revoked. That meant her influence was gone. Her control, her performance, all of it. Still, it wasn't over, because people like Irene never just surrender, they pivot. They reshape themselves into victims. And she did exactly that. 3 days later, she invited several of my father's old friends to a memorial brunch at the country club. I only found out because one of them, Mrs. Clark, called me. "Anna, dear, are you sure you won't come? Irene says it's to honor your father's memory. It might be good for closure." Closure. The word felt like a blade wrapped in ribbon. I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed that it was a setup, a way for Irene to reclaim her place as the grieving widow, to rewrite the story now slipping from her hands. But Whitman, when I told him, simply said, "Sometimes the best thing you can do is let the truth stand in the same room as the lie." Quietly. So I went. The country club was exactly as I remembered it, gleaming floors, chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, laughter that never quite reached the eyes. Irene was there, of course, in a dove-gray dress, a string of pearls that looked a little too deliberate. When she saw me, she froze for a fraction of a second, then recovered with a brittle smile. "Anna," she said, voice syrupy, "I'm so glad you could make it. I was worried we'd grown distant after everything." I held her gaze. "We did," I said softly, "and that's okay." Her smile faltered, but she didn't reply. She turned to the guests instead, launching into a speech about my father's kindness and generosity, her words dripping with nostalgia so polished it almost sounded sincere. Almost. I stayed quiet, standing near the back of the room. The brass key rested in my palm inside my pocket, a steady reminder of why I was there. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about presence, about ensuring the truth had a witness even when no one said it aloud. Then came the turn. "I just wish," Irene said dramatically, placing a hand over her heart, "that we could all move forward without this misunderstanding clouding his memory. He would have hated the fighting." Murmurs rippled through the room. A few sympathetic faces turned toward her. That's when Mrs. Clark, bless her, spoke up. "But dear, didn't the court already confirm the audit? Surely that clears up any misunderstanding." Irene's expression tightened, the corners of her smile twitching. "The audit was bureaucratic nonsense," she said, her voice sharp now. "Anna, been manipulated by people who never liked me. They're trying to destroy what your friend built." I took a slow breath and stepped forward, not raising my voice, not matching her anger. "No one's destroying anything," I said. "The audit was fair. It was handled by neutral parties. The results spoke for themselves." The room went still. A dozen eyes turned toward me. I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to argue," I continued. "I'm here because my father believed in truth, even when it made people uncomfortable. He built everything he had on that principle. And I think," I paused, steadying my voice, "that honoring him means keeping that same standard, even when it hurts." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even planned. It was just the truth, spoken quietly. The guests didn't applaud or gasp. They simply absorbed it. And that, somehow, was louder than any performance Irene could give. She tried to laugh it off, to shift the topic to something else, but the spell had broken. Her words began to falter, her smile thinning into something fragile. She finished her brunch, made her excuses, and left early, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Afterward, Mrs. Clark approached me, resting a wrinkled hand on mine. "Your father would be proud," she said. He always said grace and honesty didn't need volume to be heard. I smiled faintly. "He said that." "Many times," she nodded, "especially when your stepmother was around." When I left the club, the air outside was cool and bright. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching people drift out in small groups, their polite smiles dimming as they whispered to one another. Word was spreading again, but this time the truth had a voice. That night I wrote in my journal, public accountability achieved, truth witnessed, grace intact. It didn't feel like victory, exactly. It felt like release, like the storm had finally rolled past, leaving the air sharper and cleaner. I placed the brass key on my bedside table before turning off the light. It gleamed softly in the dark, no longer heavy with grief or suspicion. Just a quiet reminder that truth, once unlocked, never really goes back into hiding. A week after the brunch, I received the official letter from the probate court. It was printed on heavy cream paper, the kind that felt expensive just to hold. My name at the top, Irene's listed below it. The letter confirmed what we already knew. The estate's amendment had been declared invalid due to forged consent, and all prior instructions made directly by my father were now reinstated. I read it twice, letting the words sink in. It wasn't that I doubted the outcome. It was that I hadn't realized how much of me had been clenched in quiet defense this whole time. The moment I exhaled, I felt my shoulders ache, as if they'd been holding something up for months. Whitman called that afternoon. His voice, usually brisk and professional, carried a touch of warmth. "You did it," he said simply. "Your father's will stands as originally written. His legacy remains untouched." There was a pause, a heavy one. "And Irene?" I asked. "She'll be required to repay the misused funds," he replied. "Probate recommended a settlement instead of charges, provided she cooperates. Her reputation, however," he trailed off, "already handled itself," I finished for him. Because that was the truth of quiet justice. It didn't need applause. It worked its way through whispers, documents, and signed seals. Irene had always fought in the spotlight. I had one in the margins. Still, I didn't feel joy. What I felt was stillness. A silence that wasn't empty, it was earned. A few days later, I went to the old house one last time. The keys still fit the locks, though the hinges groaned when I pushed the door open. Dust coated the furniture like a soft film of memory. My father's study looked exactly as it had before Irene moved in, the same desk, the same framed photo of the two of us fishing when I was 12. I ran my fingers across the desk's edge and sat down in his chair. It was too big for me, always had been, but I could almost feel him there. The calm weight of his presence, his slow breathing, the quiet hum of logic he carried like armor. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to cry. Not the kind of crying that begs for comfort, but the kind that clears space. It wasn't just grief for losing him. It was grief for everything I'd had to become to protect him when he wasn't here to protect himself. When I finally stood, I noticed the small metal box he kept under the desk, his personal archive. Inside were letters, old photographs, and at the bottom, a folded page addressed to me. My breath caught when I saw my name written in his sharp, careful handwriting. "Anna," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you've had to fight harder than you ever wanted to. I wish I could have spared you that. But you have my steadiness, use it. Not to punish, but to protect. You'll understand that the quiet kind of strength lasts the longest." Below his signature, he had drawn a small sketch of a key, just like the brass one I'd carried for weeks. That was when I realized the key wasn't about unlocking proof or inheritance. It was about unlocking understanding. He'd trusted me not because I was his daughter, but because he believed I'd know the difference between revenge and resolution. When I left the house, I locked the door one final time, the brass key cool in my palm. It felt different now, lighter, almost warm. I decided to keep it, not as a token of property, but as a reminder that dignity can be defended without noise. The next day, I met Whitman for coffee to sign the final paperwork. He handed me one last document, the court's validation of the will and my appointment as executor. "Your father wanted you to oversee the trust distribution personally," he said. "The scholarship fund, the donation to the hospice, all of it." I looked at the page and smiled faintly. He always planned too far ahead. Whitman chuckled. He planned exactly far enough. We talked for a while about logistics, timelines, filings, transfers, but beneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding between us. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about restoring intention. As I left the cafe, Irene stood across the street, leaning against her car. Her face was thinner, her posture smaller. When our eyes met, she didn't sneer or posture. She just looked tired. I hesitated before crossing over. She didn't move until I was a few steps away. "So," she said quietly, "you won." I shook my head. No, the truth did. She looked down, her voice cracking. You think I meant for any of this to happen. I just didn't want to lose everything when he died. Something inside me softened, though not enough to forget. You didn't have to take from him to keep what mattered, I said. You just had to be honest. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. What happens to me now? That's not for me to decide, I said gently. But I'll tell you this, my father wouldn't have wanted you ruined, just accountable. She nodded slowly, then whispered, I don't deserve even that kindness. Maybe not, I said, but it's the only kind I have left to give. And then I turned and walked away, not because I didn't care, but because caring didn't have to mean staying. As I drove home, I rolled the window down and let the air rush past. The brass key sat on the passenger seat beside me, catching the sunlight. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was carrying proof. I felt like I was carrying peace. Justice had been served, quietly and completely. No courtroom drama, no public shamming. Just the slow, steady unfurling of truth, the kind that leaves both sides exposed to the light. And for the first time since my father's death, I felt like he could finally rest. In the weeks that followed, the world seemed to exhale with me. The paperwork was complete, the restitution plan finalized, and Irene had retreated into the background of her own life. There were no more phone calls, no more letters, no more carefully staged public appearances. She sold the house she'd shared with my father and moved 2 towns over. For the first time in years, her name wasn't on anyone's lips. That silence, hers and mine, felt different now. Not brittle, not tense, just settled. Every morning, I woke up a little earlier, made coffee, and opened the windows. The air was cold, sharp with autumn, the same season when everything had started unraveling months ago. Except now, it didn't feel like decay. It felt like clearing space. The trees shedding what no longer served them, the air making room for something new. I started going back through my father's notes, the old ledgers he kept for the family business. Not for legal reasons anymore, but because reading his handwriting made him feel closer. He had this way of annotating margins with phrases like, trust but verify, or paper is patient, people are. And every time I came across one of those notes, I smiled. He'd lived by a code that seemed old-fashioned in today's world. Document everything, keep your word, and if you promise peace, deliver it with fairness. That's what I wanted to do now. Deliver peace, but with boundaries. It began small. I reactivated the scholarship fund he'd created for local students, renaming it quietly in his honor, but removing both of our names from the promotional materials. It wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about restoration. When I met with the charity's director to finalize the new guidelines, she said something that stayed with me. Most families fight over what's left, she said. You've fought for what should continue. That hit deeper than I expected. Maybe because for months, all I'd done was defend, guard, prove. I hadn't realized until then that this was also about building, taking the pieces my father left and ensuring they still meant something. Whitman stopped by one afternoon with the finalized probate certificate, officially closing the case. It's done, he said, setting the folder on my table. Completely done. I turned the brass key over in my fingers while he spoke. Do you ever get used to endings? I asked. He smiled softly. You don't, but you learn which ones deserve to be quiet. After he left, I sat alone in the living room for a long while. The afternoon light poured through the window, casting long lines across the floor, the same kind of light that had shone through my father's study windows. I thought about all the moments that had led here, Irene's announcement at the will reading, the letter, the confrontation, the proofs. Every one of them had felt like a blow at the time, but now, looking back, I could see the pattern, the rhythm of cause and consequence. The slow, deliberate justice that never needed to scream. Still, peace doesn't erase fallout. It just softens it. A week later, I received a handwritten letter from Irene. It wasn't long, just 1 page. The paper was trembling with the pressure of her pen strokes. Anna, it began. You don't owe me forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But I wanted to tell you that I sold the jewelry your father gave me and donated the money to the hospice where he spent his last days. It's not enough, but it's something. I wanted to do one thing that would have made him proud of me. Take care of yourself, I mean that. No apology, not really. but something close enough to acknowledgement. It didn't redeem her, but it made her human again in my mind, flawed, selfish, but capable of remorse in the quiet aftermath of losing. I folded the letter and placed it inside my father's old archive box, next to his note and the sketch of the key. It didn't feel like closure yet. It felt like the slow cooling of embers after a fire. That night, I went to the porch and sat under the fatting sky. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the occasional hum of distant traffic. I held the brass key up to the light one last time. I realized I didn't need it anymore. I'd already unlocked everything it represented: truth, peace, understanding. The doors it opened were now metaphorical, not physical. So I took it to the garden and buried it under the old oak tree my father had planted when I was a child. The soil was cool and damp beneath my fingers. I pressed the key down deep, covering it gently with earth. It felt symbolic, almost ceremonial, the final act of letting go. When I stood up, I looked at my hands. They were smudged with dirt, but they didn't shake anymore. For months, everything I touched had felt uncertain, fragile. Now, for the first time, my hands felt steady. As I went inside, I caught my reflection in the window, tired eyes, faint smile, posture relaxed. I didn't look like someone who'd won. I looked like someone who'd finally stopped fighting. And maybe that was the truest victory of all. The morning after I buried the key, the world felt startlingly ordinary. Birds chattered outside my window. The mail arrived on time. The kettle whistled, and the scent of coffee filled the kitchen. It was all so normal that for a moment, I forgot what it had taken to reach this calm. The months of tension, the guarded silences, the endless waiting for something, anything, to shift. I sat at the table with my mug between both hands, steam curling up against my face, and realized I didn't need to brace myself anymore. There were no new letters coming, no unexpected calls, no legal summons hiding behind polite envelopes. The quiet wasn't heavy now, it was gentle. It was mine. But peace, I discovered, doesn't just arrive. It asks for maintenance. It asks for you to decide what to keep and what to let go of. That week, I began going through my father's belongings with fresh eyes. I sorted boxes, cleaned shelves, labeled old photos. Every item told a small story. The chipped mug he refused to throw away, the faded baseball cap from our last trip, the framed certificate from his first business venture. I didn't cry this time. I smiled, tracing each memory like an old song that no longer hurt to hear. When I came across the file labeled Future Projects, I hesitated. Inside were drafts of plans he'd never finished, a community workshop idea, an investment proposal for a local startup, even a rough sketch of a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs. He had been planning to build something that lasted beyond his lifetime. And that's when it struck me. I didn't just inherit assets, I'd inherited his unfinished work, his principles, his sense of purpose. That realization hit harder than the legal battles ever had. Because what he left me wasn't just money or property, it was a question. What will you do with what I built? I spent the next few days thinking about that. I met with the charity's board again and proposed expanding the scholarship fund to include mentorship. I called some of my father's old colleagues and asked if they'd volunteer time to advise new business owners in town. Every call was met with surprise at first, then enthusiasm. They missed him too, and helping felt like a way to keep him near. Word spread quietly. By the end of the month, we had a small committee forming, older professionals, retired business owners, a few community leaders. People my father had once mentored now offering to mentor others. It felt full circle in the best way. And through all of it, I could feel him with me. Not as a ghost, not as some spiritual presence, but as a steady undercurrent in every decision I made. Still, part of me wondered about Irene. Whether she'd stayed in that small apartment she'd moved to, whether she'd found work or simply disappeared into anonymity. I didn't miss her, but I didn't wish her ruin either. Some nights, I caught myself hoping she found some quiet of her own. Not forgiveness, exactly, just the kind of stillness that makes you look inward. A month later, a letter arrived from her attorney. It wasn't about money this time. It was a short notice saying that Irene had completed the restitution payment in full. She, liquidated her jewelry and remaining property to settle it early. There was also a handwritten note attached. "Anna," it read, "I've repaid what I owed. I don't expect peace between us, but I hope there's at least distance without bitterness. I've moved away for good. I'll stay out of your life as promised. Whatever legacy your father meant to leave, it's yours now. Take care of it. Take care of yourself." For a long moment, I just stared at the letter. There was no signature flourish, no drama, just finality. I folded it carefully and set it aside. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was closure. Later that evening, I walked outside to the garden. The oak tree stood still under a pale sky, its branches stretching like open arms. The grass above where I'd buried the key had already begun to settle, the earth firm again. I knelt down and pressed my palm to the soil. "It's done," I whispered, not to him, not even to Irene, just to the universe itself. "It's finally done." And as strange as it sounds, I felt something inside me unclench, something that had been wound tight since that day in the lawyer's office when Irene had announced my disinheritance. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. The truth had been seen, justice had been done, and what remained now was a choice, to live forward. That night, I wrote my final entry in the journal I'd kept through it all. "The fight is over. The quiet is mine now. I will keep what's worth keeping and let the rest rest." Then, closing the journal, I placed it beside my father's photo on the shelf. His watch lay next to it, the second hand ticking softly, a sound that no longer reminded me of loss but of rhythm, of life continuing. And I realized maybe that was his final lesson to me. That peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the grace to walk away once truth has done its work. Winter came softly that year without fanfare. The kind of winter my father used to call a thinking season. The air grew quieter, the streets slower, and in that stillness I found space to rebuild, not a home, not a legacy, but myself. I'd spent so long reacting to things, documents, accusations, half-truths, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply choose something without defense attached to it. So I started choosing again. Small things first. I redecorated my father's old study, not to erase him, but to breathe some new life into it. I replaced the heavy curtains with light linen ones that let the morning in, set a small plant on the windowsill, and hung a simple painting of an open field above his desk. It wasn't meant to symbolize anything grand, but every time I looked at it, I felt the kind of freedom that comes from making peace with your own story. One afternoon, while sorting through more of the old files, I came across an envelope I hadn't noticed before, one addressed to executor's discretion. Inside was a note in my father's familiar scrawl and a small check. The note read, "For whoever carries this forward, use it to start something that builds, not repairs. Legacy should never end with survival. It should begin again in someone else's hands." I smiled through tears. He had known somehow that I'd reach this place, not victorious but ready to begin again. So I took that small check, added to it with a bit of my own money, and officially launched the mentorship program we'd been discussing. We named it the Taylor Initiative, not after him, but after the idea of continuity, of people helping others climb without needing applause. The first session was held in the same building where my father once ran his business. The lights flickered a bit, the coffee tasted faintly burnt, and the young faces staring back at me looked nervous and hopeful all at once. I stood there, introducing the concept, sharing the mission, and for a fleeting moment, I could almost hear him behind me, clearing his throat the way he always did before speaking to a group. Afterward, one of the young participants, a girl named Marisol, came up to me and said, "You talk about your dad like he's still around." I smiled. In some ways, he is. Not in the way that hurts anymore, though, more like he's part of the blueprint. She tilted her head. "What's that mean?" "It means," I said, "that every time we choose to build instead of break, he lives a little more." That night, when I got home, I stood by the window and looked out at the oak tree again. Its branches were bare now, coated with frost that shimmered under the streetlight. Beneath it lay the brass key buried deep, a quiet artifact of everything I'd endured and learned. I thought about digging it up once or twice, just to hold it again, but no. Some things are meant to stay beneath the surface, not forgotten but grounded, like roots. Irene didn't reappear. I occasionally heard her name through a distant thread, a friend of a friend mentioning she'd taken a quiet bookkeeping job in a nearby town. It felt fitting, somehow, that she was living in numbers now, in balance sheets and accounts. A quieter kind of reckoning. I didn't wish her ill anymore. I just hoped she'd found what she was looking for in all that noise she used to create. As for me, the more I leaned into the work, the lighter everything became. People started describing me as composed, graceful, strong, and I would smile, knowing those words didn't come from who I'd always been, they came from what I'd been through. They were earned in silence, signed in patience, notarized in truth. One evening, while closing up after a mentorship session, I found myself lingering by the door. The light inside the building caught the reflection of the window, and for just a moment, I saw my own face superimposed against the city lights outside. I looked older, maybe wiser, definitely calmer. The brass key wasn't in my hand, but I still felt its weight, transformed now into something invisible yet steady. The key had always been a symbol, but I finally understood what it had unlocked. Not my father's secrets, not Irene's deceit, but my own strength. Before I left, I turned off the lights and whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Dad." It wasn't a dramatic goodbye. It wasn't even meant to be one. It was simply acknowledgement that the cycle was complete, that I'd carried the truth as far as it needed to go, and that what came next was no longer about justice. It was about grace. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cold night, the world didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like an invitation. The kind that says, quietly but surely, "You've done the hard part. Now live." Spring arrived like a slow apology, gentle and deliberate. The kind of season that didn't rush in with color but built it piece by piece, buds first, then scent, then warmth. The oak tree outside my window was greening again, its branches filling out with life that had once looked impossible in the cold months. And every morning, when the light filtered through the curtains and touched the spot where I once buried the brass key, I felt a quiet sense of completion. It had been nearly 6 months since the estate had closed. 6 months since Irene's last letter. 6 months since I'd stopped living in defense and started living in intention. There were still small remnants of the past, occasional paperwork, updates from Whitman about the trust fund, but they no longer dictated my days. The rhythm of my life had shifted. I wasn't waiting for the next storm. I was learning to tend the calm. On a Sunday morning, I decided to visit my father's grave for the first time since everything ended. I'd avoided it until now, not out of neglect, but because I wanted to come to him when I wasn't angry, when I didn't have something to prove. The air that day was cool and clear, the ground soft from a recent rain. I brought fresh lilies, his favorite, and a folded note I'd written the night before. The cemetery was quiet except for birdsong and the soft rustle of wind through leaves. I found his headstone easily. It was simple, understated, exactly as he would have wanted. No marble angels or etched tributes, just his name, his birth and death dates, and a single line below them. Integrity is the quietest kind of courage. I knelt, brushing a few stray petals from the stone, and smiled through a tightness in my chest. "You were right," I whispered. "You always were." For a long while, I just sat there, the note still in my hand. Finally, I unfolded it and read it aloud, not because I thought he could hear me, but because I needed to hear myself say the words. "You didn't leave me alone, Dad. You left me prepared. You taught me that truth doesn't shout, it waits. That justice doesn't come from revenge, but from resolve. I didn't win because Irene lost. I won because I learned when to stop fighting. And I'm okay now, I promise." I laid the note under the vase of flowers, pressing it down so the wind wouldn't carry it away. Then I sat back and just breathed, letting the sun warm my face. I thought about all the nights I'd spent chasing answers, the anxiety that had lived in my bones for months, the ache of wanting to be believed. And now, sitting there, none of it mattered anymore. The truth had settled. The story had told itself. When I left the cemetery, I didn't look back. There was no need. He wasn't behind me anymore. He was somewhere in every decision I made, every calm response I gave, every quiet victory I no longer needed to explain. That afternoon, I stopped by the mentorship center to drop off supplies. The building hummed with the sound of conversation and possibility. Marisol was there again, standing by the whiteboard, explaining a business plan to a small group of newcomers. Her voice was confident, her laughter easy. She caught my eye when she noticed me in the doorway and grinned. "You taught me not to flinch when someone doubts me," she said. "It's working." I laughed softly. "I didn't teach you that. You already had it in you. You just needed a reason to use it." As I watched her lead the group, I realized the story didn't end where I thought it did. It wasn't about a will or a court or a reckoning. It was about continuation, the quiet ripple effect of choosing truth over bitterness, structure over chaos, compassion over victory. Later that evening, I sat by the window at home again, just like I had in those early days when everything was uncertain. But now, the glass didn't reflect fear. It reflected light, the soft gold of sunset sliding across the room. I could see the garden, the oak tree, the faint patch of earth where the keys slept beneath the soil. I took out my journal, the one that had carried every raw thought from the start, and wrote the last entry. Today, I realized that closure isn't something that happens once, it's something you keep choosing. Every time you forgive quietly, every time you hold a boundary with grace, every time you build instead of break. That's the work. That's the legacy. I closed the book and set it beside the photo of my father. His watch still sat there too, ticking softly, steady as ever. I didn't wind it anymore, but it still kept perfect time. Somehow that felt right. As the last light faded, I whispered, not to him, not even to myself, but into the space that had carried all this transformation. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. Then I turned off the lamp, leaned back, and let the quiet settle around me. Not the kind of quiet that comes from loss, but the kind that feels like peace finally earned. The story had come full circle, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to say, just the soft rhythm of a life beginning again, one calm breath at a time.